morning, good evening, wherever you may be around the city, across the state, coming to you live from the heart of Chicago. This is Mr. Moeller, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about the road to the American Revolution, kind of the decade and the debate leading up to America's entrance into the Revolutionary War. So our story really begins where the last one ended, which was the victory in the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, in which the American colonies in Britain successfully defeated kind of an alliance of France and others. And so in the aftermath of this war, wars change a lot of things. There's always kind of this idea that wars destroy everything, chaos is a ladder. And so in the aftermath, both the colonies in Britain looked to fundamentally change their relationship to each other. Britain saw this as an opportunity to take these colonies that had kind of always been on their own and bring them into the British Empire in a much more significant way. And a big piece of that was that the colonists should help pay for the war that they fought, and that Britain basically said, hey, we fought this war for you. And so that's a really big piece of this. Then kind of secondly, Britain wants to control the colonists expanding into American Indian territories. Because if they're expanding into American Indian territories, well, that could trigger wars, and Britain actually had an alliance with a lot of these tribes. But on the other hand, the colonists, they're going to believe that after winning the war, they actually should even have more autonomy, more self-control. And furthermore, they believe that they're kind of equal partners in this whole deal. And so, also too, because of the war, colonists are beginning to think a lot more about working together as the colonies, not just one colony. And so all of this is going to lead to massive disagreements over the new British government and the massive military presence that's going to be there. So kind of my theory that I put out about the revolution is that it's a consequence of differing expectations. England saw this as an opportunity to reform, bring the colonies closer into the British Empire, tax them, and bring the same way that they tax their own citizens and other citizens in the empire. And all this is to say they want to kind of bring them into the family. The colonies that kind of existed off on their own, England is trying to bring them into the family. The colonies, on the other hand, they see themselves as almost the equals now of Great Britain. They expect that they will be equal partners in the empire. They expect even more autonomy and more freedom in terms of, there's no more threat of war, so we should be able to trade with whoever we want, expand wherever we want. And so they begin to see these reforms not as as a good change, but as a threat to their traditional governments and their ways of governing and their freedoms. And so for about 10 years, from 1764 to 1777, the crisis between the colonies and Great Britain is going to deepen and deepen, leading to a debate over the possibility of independence for the colonies. And so it kind of really begins when Great Britain asserts control of the colonies after the French and Indian War. And one of the first laws that does this is the World Proclamation of 1763. And this essentially drew a line on the map, as you can see right there, that colonists were not allowed to settle west of. Britain had arrangements with many tribes that was Indian territory, that it was not for colonists to go and start a war. But the colonists felt, well, we had fought for that land, they felt entitled to it because they had won it from France. And so Western expansion is going to be one of the first major issues that the colonists are going to kind of come head to head with Great Britain over. Then there's a series of customs reforms. That's laws that deal with imports like taxes and things like that. And all these new laws that came into place, different taxes and restrictions, led to an increase in smuggling, which then in turn led Great Britain to have to increase their military presence in order to police all this smuggling that is going on. So you can see how this is starting to snowball, and it's going to get bigger and bigger over this decade. So two taxes in 1764 and 65 also really peeved off the colonists in a pretty significant way. One was a tax on sugar, the other was a tax on paper goods that becomes known as the Stamp Act. And both of these taxes essentially, along with the Quartering Act of 1765, really placed the financial burden on the colonies to pay for the military presence, to help pay for the administering of the royal government. And so the colonists saw all these kind of taxes and fees as violating their economic freedom that they so valued. And so in 1765, in response to all these laws, the colonial leadership, kind of the leaders of the individual colonies, got together in what became known as the Stamp Act Congress. They got together for a couple of purposes. One was to draft a statement to send to Great Britain saying why they believed the tax was unjust. They argued that only the colonial government should be the one taxing them, and that since they were not represented in the British government, that they should not have to follow any laws made by that government. Again, social contracts, self-rule, an important aspect of kind of colonial culture. So the second thing that they organized is a boycott of British imports. And this actually works more than anything else in getting Britain to get rid of the Stamp Act. And so the boycott, the refusal to buy British goods, is actually the most significant thing outside of the colonial leadership coming together in 1765. So in the largest colony, a much bigger debate was going on about whether or not Britain really had any authority, right? Just power inside of the colonies. And so Virginia drafted the Virginia Resolves, and they declared that Great Britain had no right to tax them and pretty much no right to really rule them at all, to pass laws that they had to follow and other various things. And so what we're starting to see here is that two distinct kind of thought patterns are emerging, patriots and loyalists. So the patriots are those that want kind of the colonies to be very independent. Loyalists are the ones that recognize the reality that the British government, the British Empire, is a really great thing to be a part of. And so by this point, the majority of colonists still very much not in favor of any independence movement. They're looking for reform and change, not for revolution. And so the crisis is going to deepen and get even worse in the city of Boston, Massachusetts. Boston Harbor is a very kind of busy place, and it was also a hotbed of smuggling and anti-British sentiment. And all this kind of led to increased military presence to enforce laws. And as we see sometimes in society, when kind of tensions rise, violence can erupt. And so a group in the colonies that was kind of committed to trying to, I guess, disrupt the British at any opportunity was the Sons of Liberty. They're an anti-British organization, and they're famous for attacking British officials and British tax collectors. They would tar and feather them, intimidate them, destroy their homes. And so in a lot of ways, you could consider what the Sons of Liberty doing, it's a little bit of terrorism. They're trying to intimidate government officials into not following the laws. Which all of this, of course, if there's going to be law breaking, there's going to be a crackdown. And so the Townshend Acts is going to be a crackdown aimed primarily at Boston. We're going to have new import taxes, harsher penalties for smuggling, more British government officials sent over from Britain to rule. And they also assert very, very clearly that they alone, the British Empire, controls the colonies, and therefore they have the right to tax them. And so the Townshend Acts is a very kind of symbolic moment in which Britain is kind of saying the colonies are not independent, they are a part of the empire. And so in 1770, after kind of all this stuff had happened, tensions are very, very high. Tensions over the Townshend Acts, tensions over everything. And so at night, an altercation between some Bostonians and British soldiers happens. There are a lot of differing accounts of this. Some say that the colonists were throwing snowballs, some said rocks, but all we know is that there was an altercation. At the end of it, 5 people were dead. This was a huge scandal. It spread across the colonies. People were outraged. People were upset. People took to the streets. And so Britain, in response, actually got rid of most of the Townshend Acts in response to this. And so what you guys are going to look at in the Boston Massacre investigation is what really happened. Because the truth is, we may never know. So you guys are going to look into that on your own. But this is the image that most colonists are going to see first of the Boston Massacre. It's a very iconic image. It appears in every single U.S. history textbook. But again, this might not be a very accurate representation of what happened on that night. So again, dig further into the investigation. But if this is the image you see, you're going to believe the British are pretty bloodthirsty, pretty violent, and that's going to lead you to maybe be very skeptical of them saying, hey, we want you to be a part of our empire. And so for about 3 years, tensions are very low. The Townshend Acts are gone, there's no more incidents. But in 1773, the Tea Act was passed, and this for a lot of colonists is going to end up being one of the final straws. The Tea Act, it's not actually a tax on tea. To be technical, it's actually a bailout of a British company. The Tea Act essentially gave a British company the ability to sell cheaper prices, to undercut merchants, and also the Townshend tax is still being collected, so the colonists are then paying this tax that they said they would not pay. And so all this leads to the colonial merchants and smugglers being very angry. Business of smugglers is threatened. Business of merchants is threatened. The issue of taxation still has not been resolved. So there's a lot of issues that are going on as this Tea Act is building up. And so in reaction to the Tea Act, those Sons of Liberty decide that they're going to stage a mass destruction of property, of what they're going to call a protest, and that's going to become known as the Boston Tea Party. And in 1773, $1 million worth of property was destroyed by the Sons of Liberty throwing it into Boston Harbor. Again, question, is this terrorism? Is this a protest? All sorts of space for debate there. A crowd formed in this time to like cheer them on, and so there's actually like, it's a big event. But this act really is going to be the thing that leads to the ultimate crackdown on all these challenges to the authority of the government. You cannot destroy property and expect there to be no consequences. And so in response to the Boston Tea Party, Great Britain is going to pass what becomes known as the Coercive Acts. And so the Coercive Acts shut down Boston's port. They removed all elected officials and replaced them by royally appointed kind of governors and people. They banned all the town meetings that the kind of people were having. And the governor could also transfer any soldiers that they wanted to England, and instead of being, put on trial by the Americans. And so ultimately, these coercive acts in the minds of the colonists, they violate the right to a trial by jury. They violate the right to not have troops, in one's home. The king was also not supposed to have a standing army in peacetime without parliament. And the colonies say, hey, how come we can't authorize an army? And so ultimately, Boston is feeling that the coercive acts are really stripping them of their rights, both their British rights, but also kind of their inalienable rights, their human rights. And so the First Continental Congress was called. Representatives from every colony are going to gather in order to talk about what happened with the Coercive Acts and what their next step should be. The idea is if they can do this to Boston, they can do this to any of us. And so they organized a boycott. But perhaps most importantly, they organized and promised to meet in the next year should the situation not be resolved. And when they meet the next year, the Revolutionary War had actually begun. And so the question of independence starts to kind of go out in the colonies and be debated by American citizens. The patriots say that the colonies have moved beyond Great Britain, that they are better off with economic and political independence, and that Great Britain has violated the social contract at every turn. But on the other hand, the loyalists point out the political and economic benefits, the protection, the markets of the British Empire. They point out the potential foolishness of a war fought against Britain and the inevitable civil war that would break out in the colonies between the patriots and the loyalists. And many loyalists also had this very sentiment that they culturally, socially, were British, and that these colonies were birthed by Great Britain, and so they ultimately belonged to the empire. And so all across the colonies, debate was happening about what the Americans should do. And so what you guys are going to look at is the debate over independence to try to see if this kind of Revolutionary War is going to be justified at all. So begin working on your 2 investigations and have a great day.